Halloween is a horror masterpiece that has marked the history of cinema, transforming the figure of the masked serial killer into an icon of the genre. Directed by John Carpenter and released in theaters on October 25, 1978, the film is considered one of the most ever influential in the horror scene. Let's find out in detail what makes this film so special. John Carpenter, together with co-screenwriter Deborah Hill, created a film that with a small budget of just $300,000 managed to gross over $70 million worldwide. This resounding success was achieved thanks to a winning combination of suspense, atmosphere, and a haunting soundtrack, composed by Carpenter himself. The story takes place in the fictional town of Haddonfield, Illinois, and revolves around Michael Myers, a man who, at the age of 6, brutally murders his older sister on Halloween night. 15 years later, Michael escapes from the asylum where he was locked up and returns to Haddonfield, beginning to stalk a young girl, Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, in what becomes a deadly chase. Laurie, an ordinary high school student, suddenly finds herself having to face pure evil embodied in Michael Myers, whose face is hidden by a white mask that has become a recognizable symbol of pop culture. Dr. Sam Loomis, played by Donald Pleasance, is Michael's psychiatrist and represents the only figure who understands the true nature of the evil that lies behind the mask. Loomis' desperate hunt to stop Michael before he can strike again adds another layer of tension to the plot. Michael Myers was defined as pure evil by Dr. Loomis and represents one of the most terrifying incarnations of cinematic horror. Almost superhuman in his physical endurance and apparent indestructibility, Michael is often described as an unstoppable force, acting with no apparent motivation other than to kill. His lack of humanity is accentuated by the expressionless white mask he wears, a modified version of a Captain Kirk mask from Star Trek, painted white. One of the most memorable features of Halloween is the soundtrack, composed by John Carpenter himself. The main theme, played with a simple synthesizer, has become one of the most iconic pieces of music in cinema history. With a repetitive and distressing rhythm, the music increases the spectator's tension and anxiety, causing him to sink deeper and deeper into a climate of terror. John Carpenter, then an emerging director, and Deborah Hill, who co-wrote the film and produced with Carpenter, brought Halloween to life on a shoestring budget of just $300,000. To keep costs down, Carpenter recruited a largely unknown cast, starting with Jamie Lee Curtis, making her feature film debut. Curtis, daughter of celebrated actress Janet Leigh, the unforgettable shower star in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, brought with her a legacy that would give her role greater resonance. The screenplay, despite being simple, is extraordinarily effective. Carpenter and Hill opted for a minimalist plot that focuses on a single night of terror, making suspense the true protagonist of the film. Filming took place over just 20 days in the spring of 1978, mostly in South Pasadena, California, which played the fictional town of Haddonfield, Illinois. The interiors of the house where Laurie Strode lives were decorated by Deborah Hill herself, using personal objects to add a touch of authenticity. Michael Myers, often referred to in the script simply as the Shape, represents the archetype of absolute evil, devoid of emotion, motivation, or qualms. His figure embodies the irrational and universal fear of the unknown, of the evil that hides behind normality. The mask worn by Michael Myers has become one of the most iconic objects in cinematic history. It was a mask of Captain Kirk, Star Trek character played by William Shatner, which was modified by painting it white, enlarging the eye holes and adding artificial hair. This mask, expressionless and dehumanizing, contributed to making Myers a frightening figure, a sort of boogeyman par excellence. Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, is the antithesis of the classic hero. Far from being the typical courageous and invincible protagonist, Laurie is an ordinary, introverted and responsible girl who finds herself involuntarily involved in a nightmare. Her fight to survive Michael Myers' murderous rampage made her a female icon in horror cinema, elevating Curtis to the status of Scream Queen. The character of Laurie has had a lasting impact, in part due to her ability to portray everyday heroism. She is not a warrior, but an ordinary person who manages to survive thanks to her cunning and determination. This made Laurie a character that many viewers can identify with, increasing tension and empathy throughout the film. Another fundamental element that contributed to the success of Halloween is its soundtrack, composed by Carpenter himself in just 3 days. The main theme, built on a 5/4 rhythm and played with a synthesizer, became instantly recognizable. The hypnotic and disturbing repetitiveness of the musical theme amplifies the anguish, creating a sense of inevitability that accompanies every appearance of Michael Myers on the screen. The simplicity of the musical composition reflects the minimalist approach of the film itself. There is no need for elaborate orchestrations or sophisticated special effects. It is precisely in its essentiality that Halloween finds its strength. The soundtrack becomes a sort of acoustic signature of terror, warning the viewer that evil is lurking. Carpenter and director of photography Dean Cundey masterfully exploited light and darkness to build the film's atmosphere. The scenes are often lit in such a way that the figure of Michael Myers only partially emerges from the shadows, creating an effect of subliminal terror. This play of light and shadow is crucial to the sense of constant threat that permeates the film. Domestic spaces, usually associated with safety and comfort, become places of danger and terror. The use of subjective point of view, particularly in the opening scenes where we follow Michael through his eyes as he commits his first murder, was innovative for its time and helped engage the viewer in a more direct and disturbing way. This technical gimmick was later imitated in numerous other horror films. The success of Halloween gave birth to an entire franchise, with numerous sequels, remakes, and reboots that explored and expanded the myth of Michael Myers. Jamie Lee Curtis has returned to play Laurie Strode on several occasions, including the very recent 2018 reboot and its sequels, Halloween Kills, 2021, and Halloween Ends, 2022. These films updated the myth for a new generation, without losing the underlying theme of the original, the eternal struggle between good and evil. In addition to its commercial success, Halloween established many of the tropes that would become characteristic of the slasher genre, such as the final girl trope, the use of suburban locations, and the portrayal of violence as inescapable. These elements were taken up and reworked in later films such as Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Scream. Halloween also paved the way for independent cinema, proving that with talent, vision, and little means you can create a work destined to become an immortal classic. Its influence extends beyond cinema, having inspired video games, comics, novels, and even Halloween costumes that populate the streets every year. Halloween is not just a film, but an experience. Every element, from Carpenter's direction to Jamie Lee Curtis' performance, from the soundtrack to the mask design, contributes to creating a work of art that has stood the test of even today. More than 40 years after its release, Halloween continues to terrify and fascinate audiences, confirming itself as one of the greatest horror masterpieces. It is a film that, like Michael Myers, seems destined to never die never, continuing to live in the dreams and nightmares of generations of spectators. Halloween 2 is the second chapter of the legendary horror saga that began with Halloween in 1978. Directed by Rick Rosenthal and produced by the original creators John Carpenter and Deborah Hill, this 1981 film is a crucial piece in the construction of the myth of Michael Myers, an icon of terror that has left an indelible mark on the horror genre. Let's explore the details of this film that continue to shape the archetype of the boogeyman and the slasher film. The film picks up exactly where the first one left off, on a Halloween night that has now become legendary. Laurie Strode, Jamie Lee Curtis, still in shock from the attack she suffered, is taken to Haddonfield Memorial Hospital, a place that soon becomes the scene of new horrors. Michael Myers, who survived the shooting of Dr. Loomis, Donald Pleasance, is still at large and determined to complete his work of death. The hospital setting gives the film a particularly claustrophobic atmosphere. The desolate corridors, the dark and silent rooms, and the skeleton staff during the night shift, make the hospital a perfect place for Michael, who moves like a shadow within its walls, chasing away anyone who crosses his path. I walk. Laurie, despite her injuries, is forced to fight for her life in a place that should offer her safety, but instead turns into a deadly labyrinth. Jamie Lee Curtis returns to the role of Laurie Strode, a character who evolves further in this sequel. If in the first film Laurie was a frightened young babysitter, here we see her transform into a survivor who fights with every fiber of her being. Curtis' performance is heightened by Laurie's physical vulnerability, forced to fight despite her injuries and psychological trauma. Her character is the embodiment of resilience, a symbol of female strength that has become central to horror mythology. Donald Pleasance, as Dr. Sam Loomis, is even more haunted and desperate in this film. Loomis is not just a doctor, but a monster hunter, convinced that Michael Myers is not simply a man, but evil incarnate. His determination to stop Michael is almost maniacal, and his figure stands like a modern Van Helsing, fighting against an evil that only he seems to truly understand. The role of Michael Myers is played by Dick Warlock, who imbues the character with an even more menacing and unstoppable presence. His slow but inexorable gait and expressionless mask make him an almost supernatural entity, a symbol of terror that cannot be stopped or killed. Rick Rosenthal's direction is faithful to the aesthetics of the first film, but with some significant evolutions. While John Carpenter directed the first film with a more subtle and psychological approach, Rosenthal introduces a greater focus on action and violence. This change in style responds to the requests of an audience now accustomed to an escalation of brutality in horror cinema, inaugurated by films such as Halloween and Friday the 13th. However, Rosenthal's stylistic choices maintain the key element of the first film, the masterful use of light and shadows. The hospital, with its dimly lit corridors and deserted operating rooms, becomes a dark labyrinth, where Michael's presence is felt more than seen. The use of the Steadicam, introduced by Carpenter in the first film, is taken up and expanded here, to give the viewer the sensation of being observed, or worse, persecuted. The special effects in Halloween 2 are gorier than the first film, with murder scenes that are much more graphic and detailed. This change was partly influenced by the success of other slasher horror films of the time, which were raising the stakes in terms of blood and gore. Among the film's most memorable killings is that of Nurse Karen, immersed in a hot tub of boiling water, a scene that combines erotic tension and terror in a crescendo of physical horror. The practical effects used to simulate fatal burns and the gradual escalation of violence show a significant evolution in the way fear is portrayed on screen. The sets, especially the hospital ones, were designed to create a sense of isolation and desolation. Haddonfield Memorial Hospital is almost a character in its own right, with its long empty corridors, flashing lights and empty spaces ringing with an eerie silence. Every corner seems to hide a threat, and the hospital transforms from a place of healing into a real infernal labyrinth. The soundtrack for Halloween 2 is the work of John Carpenter, this time joined by Alan Howarth. The main Halloween theme is revived, but with new nuances. The intensified use of synthesizers gives the music a darker and more metallic tone, in line with the more brutal atmosphere of the film. Music is not just an accompaniment, but a real instrument of tension. The recurring theme of Michael Myers is instantly recognizable and elicits an almost Pavlovian sense of panic in the audience. The film's use of sound is equally effective. Michael's slow, inexorable footsteps, the hiss of the wind passing through the corridors, and the sudden silences preceding the attacks all contribute to creating an aural experience that amplifies the visual horror. One of the central themes of Halloween 2 is the unstoppable nature of evil. Michael Myers is not just a man, but a relentless force that cannot be stopped by conventional means. This idea is reinforced by the revelation that Laurie Strode is actually Michael's sister, a familial connection that inexorably ties the fates of the two characters. This element of kinship adds a tragic dimension to the narrative, suggesting that Laurie cannot escape her fate, being linked to evil by blood. The film also explores the theme of human vulnerability. The hospital setting, usually a place of care and protection, becomes a battlefield where people are at the mercy of a killer. Laurie, wounded and debilitated, represents humanity in a moment of extreme fragility, forced to confront a force that goes beyond human understanding. Upon release, Halloween 2 received mixed reactions. Many critics appreciated the continuity with the original film and the ability to maintain high tension, but some complained of an excessive focus on violence compared to the psychological suspense that had characterized the first film. Despite these criticisms, the film was commercially successful, cementing its position as one of the best horror sequels. Over time, Halloween 2 has been re-evaluated by critics and fans of the genre, becoming a classic of horror cinema. The film has had a lasting impact on popular culture, helping to define the slasher film canon and cement the myth of Michael Myers as one of cinema's most iconic killers. His influence can be seen in numerous subsequent horror films, and his legacy continues to live on in the numerous revivals and reinterpretations of the Halloween saga. Halloween 2 is a sequel that manages to expand the myth of Michael Myers, carrying forward a narrative that mixes terror, violence and symbolism. The film not only continues the story begun in 1978, but enriches it with new meanings, transforming that Halloween night into an endless nightmare. With its incisive direction, an unforgettable soundtrack and performances that have left their mark, Halloween 2 remains a milestone in the world of horror, a film that has been able to scare generations of spectators and continues to do so today. Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, released in cinemas in 1982, represents one of the most controversial chapters of the famous horror saga that began with John Carpenter's 1978 film, Halloween. After the success of the first two films, which revolved around the character of Michael Myers, the producers, including Carpenter himself and his collaborator Deborah Hill, decided to take a completely different direction. The intention was to transform the series into a sort of horror anthology, with each new film focusing on an independent story linked to the Halloween holiday. Carpenter and Hill were convinced that the character of Michael Myers had exhausted his narrative potential after the second film, and they wanted to explore new ideas. Thus was born Halloween 3, The Lord of the Night, a film that radically departed from its predecessors, both in terms of plot and tone. The story of Halloween 3 takes place in a small California town, Santa Mira, where the Silver Shamrock Mask Factory is located. The film opens with a man, Harry Grimbridge, Al Berry, fleeing in terror with one of the Silver Shamrock masks and being mysteriously killed. Before dying, Harry manages to deliver a mask to a gas station attendant, who takes him to the hospital. Here Dr. Daniel Dan Shallis, played by Tom Atkins, enters the scene, a doctor who finds himself involved in the disturbing mystery. Shallis, together with Ellie Grimbridge, Stacy Nelkin, Harry's daughter, decides to investigate the man's death. Their investigations lead them to discover that Conal Cochran, Dan O'Herlihy, the enigmatic owner of the Silver Shamrock, is at the center of a diabolical plot. Cochrane stole one of the Stonehenge stones and, using ancient magic combined with advanced technology, created electronic chips to insert into the masks his factory produces. These chips contain fragments of the sacred stone and, activated by a special television signal broadcast on Halloween night, kill anyone wearing the mask, releasing insects and snakes that emerge from the victims' heads. Cochrane's goal is to perform a mass sacrifice to honor an ancient Celtic ritual tied to Samhain, the pagan version of Halloween. This sacrifice, according to Cochrane, would bring ancient traditions back to life and punish humanity for having forgotten the true roots of the holiday. The film culminates with a desperate attempt by Chalice to stop the broadcast of the commercial, but the ending is deliberately ambiguous. The last image is that of Chalice screaming at the television to stop the broadcast, while the screen goes black. Halloween 3 is an experimental film in many ways. Instead of relying on a masked killer like Michael Myers, the film tackles more complex themes, such as the power of technology, mind control, and the idea of human sacrifice. The combination of sci-fi elements with Celtic folklore creates a unique atmosphere, which differentiates the film from the standards of the slasher genre popular at the time. Director Tommy Lee Wallace, Carpenter's longtime collaborator, chose to use a visual aesthetic that recalled the paranoia typical of 1950s science fiction films, but with a modern twist. The scenes set in the Silver Shamrock factory, with its sterile environments and robotic workers, evoke a feeling of cold alienation, in stark contrast to the traditional and familiar image of the Halloween party. The soundtrack, composed by John Carpenter and Alan Howarth, plays a crucial role in building the tension and anxiety of the film. The musical themes are heavily synthesized, with the use of electronic sounds giving the film a futuristic and dystopian tone. The famous advertising jingle, Silver Shamrock, repeated obsessively throughout the film, becomes a disturbing recurring motif that underlines the mental manipulation and inevitability of Cochrane's plan. Upon its release, Halloween 3 received mixed reviews. Many critics and fans felt betrayed by Michael Myers' absence, and the film was considered both a commercial and creative failure. However, as the years have passed, Halloween 3 has been re-evaluated, above all thanks to its originality and courage to break the mold of the saga. Modern critics now see the film as an underrated work, offering an interesting reflection on the commercialization of the holiday and the loss of the original meaning of Halloween. Its combination of technological horror and ancient mythology was praised for its originality, and the film was rediscovered as a cult classic within the horror landscape. Halloween 3 has had a lasting impact on popular culture, despite its initial negative reception. The Silver Shamrock jingle has become an icon of horror cinema, often referenced or parodied. Furthermore, the film influenced other directors and screenwriters, who saw in it an example of how horror cinema can explore social and technological themes through an unconventional approach. The attempt to turn the Halloween series into an anthology was unsuccessful, but Halloween 3 remains a fascinating experiment. The film demonstrated that, despite operating within an established franchise, it is possible to tell new and innovative stories, even if at the cost of risking the alienation of a portion of the audience. In conclusion, Halloween 3 is a film that deserves to be re-evaluated in light of its uniqueness within the Halloween saga. Although its lack of direct connection to Michael Myers disappointed fans at the time of its release, today the film is appreciated for its narrative courage, its disturbing atmosphere, and its ability to explore deep themes through the filter of horror cinema. When viewed as a standalone work, Halloween 3 offers an intriguing and thought-provoking cinematic experience, making it an important piece in the history of horror cinema. Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, is a 1988 horror film directed by Dwight H. Little, the fourth chapter of the famous Halloween saga created by John Carpenter. After the absence of the legendary serial killer Michael Myers in the third chapter, this film marks his long-awaited return and strives to recover the spirit of original terror that had made the saga a point of reference in the slasher genre. The story takes place 10 years after the events of the first and second films. Michael Myers, who survived the 1978 fire, remained in a coma under medical supervision. However, during a transfer from Ridgemont Psychiatric Hospital, Michael awakens to overhear that he has a granddaughter, Jamie Lloyd, played by Danielle Harris, the daughter of Laurie Strode, who lives in Haddonfield. Michael, driven by an insatiable desire to kill his only remaining relative, manages to escape and heads towards Haddonfield, sowing death and destruction along the way. Dr. Sam Loomis, played by the great Donald Pleasance, always obsessed with hunting Michael, immediately senses his plan and launches into a race against time to protect Jamie and stop his enemy once and for all. Meanwhile, Jamie lives with the Carruthers' adoptive family, unaware of her frightening heritage, but soon senses that something evil is seeking her. One of the most appreciated aspects of Halloween 4 is its ability to restore the oppressive atmosphere and disturbing tension of the first films. The small town of Haddonfield, with its quiet streets and houses decorated for Halloween, turns into a nightmare scenario once again when Michael Myers strikes again. Dwight H. Little's direction expertly plays with light and shadow, creating moments of authentic terror without ever resorting excessively to special effects or gore. After the success of the first two films in the Halloween saga, the third chapter, Halloween 3, The Lord of the Night, attempted a significant change of direction, moving away from the figure of Michael Myers to tell a completely different story. However, the absence of the famous masked killer led to mixed reactions, and many fans were disappointed. This led the producers, including Mustafa Akkad, to rethink the strategy for the fourth chapter, deciding to bring Michael Myers back to the fore. The film was produced on a budget of approximately $5 million, an investment that proved fruitful, as the film grossed over $17 million at the box office in the United States alone. The screenplay for Halloween 4 was written by Alan B. McElroy in a record time of just 11 days, due to an impending writer's strike. McElroy then had to work quickly to develop a plot that was consistent with the events of the first two films, completely ignoring the events of Halloween 3. In his writing, McElroy introduced the character of Jamie Lloyd, imagining her as the daughter of Laurie Strode, the character played by Jamie Lee Curtis in the original films. A crucial aspect of any Halloween movie is the Michael Myers mask. In Halloween 4, the production faced several difficulties in recreating the original mask. During filming, multiple versions of the mask were used, one of which looked slightly different from the previous films. This detail did not go unnoticed by the most avid fans, but despite the criticism, the mask continued to instill the same terror thanks to the neutral and icy expression that represents the face of evil. As for the special effects, the film opted for a relatively restrained approach compared to other slashers of the time, focusing more on atmosphere and the clever use of shadows than on excessively gore scenes. However, there are some memorable sequences, such as the scene in which Michael kills an ambulance worker by breaking his neck with just one hand, a moment that highlights the character's superhuman strength. Filming took place mainly in Salt Lake City, Utah, during April and May 1988. The choice of Salt Lake City as a location was dictated by economic reasons, since filming in this city was more convenient than other areas of the United States. One of the biggest challenges was simulating autumn, as the filming took place in spring. Paper leaves and decorations were distributed on the streets to give the impression that Haddonfield was ready for Halloween. The soundtrack, curated by Alan Howarth, faithfully reproduces John Carpenter's iconic themes, enriching them with new arrangements that maintain the sinister and disturbing tone. Howarth, Carpenter's longtime collaborator, managed to preserve the essence of the main theme, made up of simple and repetitive notes that create a growing tension, giving the film that feeling of inevitability and horror that is typical of the saga. Upon release, Halloween 4 received mixed reception from critics. Some critics appreciated the return to the original formula, praising the atmosphere and tension building, while others found the film too predictable and similar to its predecessors. However, over the years, the film has been re-evaluated and has acquired a cult status among fans of the genre. The character of Jamie Lloyd, in particular, has been recognized as one of the best introduced in the saga after Laurie Strode, thanks to Danielle Harris's convincing performance. There are several moments in the film that have become iconic over the years. A particularly memorable scene is when Michael appears on the roof of the police car and begins to massacre the officers. The sequence is shot to emphasize Michael's invulnerability and the character's terror, providing one of the film's most tense moments. The ending, which suggests a passing of the torch of evil from Michael to Jamie, was also surprising and controversial, laying the groundwork for future sequels. Halloween 4 not only brought Michael Myers back to life, but also influenced many of the slasher films that followed in the 1990s and 2000s. The film solidified some of Michael's character traits, his relentlessness, silence, and apparent invincibility. This chapter also reaffirmed the importance of the Halloween saga within the horror landscape, demonstrating that, despite the passing of the years, Michael Myers remains an unquestionably terrifying figure. In conclusion, Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers is a film that was able to restore the atmosphere of terror of the first chapters, managing to satisfy fans of the saga and leaving an indelible mark in the history of horror cinema. With a mix of nostalgia, tension and iconic moments, this chapter represents a return to the origins for the franchise and a fundamental stage in its evolution. Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers is a 1989 horror film directed by Dominique Othenin-Girard. It is the fifth chapter of the legendary horror saga inaugurated by John Carpenter in 1978. This episode continues to explore the exploits of the infamous Michael Myers, the invincible masked serial killer, who has returned once again to terrorize the small town of Haddonfield. The film, which follows Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, 1988, attempts to further expand the mythology around Myers and his connection to the young Jamie Lloyd. The incipit of Halloween 5 connects directly to the events of Halloween 4. After apparently being killed, Michael Myers, played by Don Shanks, survives once again and spends a year recovering in secret. The film opens with a sequence in which Michael is treated by a hermit who lives isolated in the woods, but, once healed, he does not hesitate to kill him and resume his mission of death. His main victim is once again the young Jamie Lloyd, played by Danielle Harris, his granddaughter, who by the end of the fourth film had shown disturbing signs of a possible evil legacy. In this chapter, Jamie is deeply traumatized and finds herself in a clinic for children with psychological problems. Although she has become mute due to the shock, she appears to have a mysterious psychic connection with Michael, allowing her to sense his actions and predict his movements. As Michael grows closer to Jamie, Dr. Sam Loomis, Donald Pleasance, Myers' tireless psychiatrist, is more determined than ever to stop his former patient. Loomis desperately tries to protect Jamie and use their connection to set a trap for Michael. The film then develops into a series of clashes between Loomis, Michael, and the police, culminating in a dramatic and ambivalent ending. Dominique Othenin-Girard introduces a more gothic and psychological touch to the series. Unlike previous chapters, this film places more emphasis on atmosphere and psychological tension rather than explicit violence. Jamie's visions, which are often confined to closed, claustrophobic spaces, add a level of anguish that permeates the entire film. The film continues to use the classic soundtrack composed by John Carpenter, but reinvents it with darker and less melodic tones, reflecting the mental deterioration of the main characters. Michael's mask, slightly different from previous films, appears even more ghostly and less human, accentuating his supernatural figure. Halloween 5 did not receive the same level of critical and commercial success as its predecessors. Many critics considered the plot confusing and some narrative choices ineffective, such as the introduction of new mythological elements, the mysterious man in black and the spine symbol, which are not explained in the film itself. However, the film was appreciated for Danielle Harris's performance and the intensity of Dr. Loomis, played by Donald Pleasance. Another point of criticism was that the film seems to follow the formula established by previous installments too closely, without introducing enough new features to stand out. Despite this, it has become a cult film for fans of the saga, especially those who appreciate the darker and less conventional chapters of the series. Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers, is a chapter that, despite its imperfections, continues to explore the myth of Michael Myers with a darker and more psychological vision. Although not universally loved, the film left a mark on the history of the saga, helping to consolidate Michael Myers as one of the most iconic and unstoppable figures in horror. For fans of the series, it represents an important piece of the puzzle, preparing the ground for the subsequent developments of the saga and the evolution of the myth of Michael Myers. Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, 1995, represents a significant, and at the same time controversial, piece within the famous horror saga begun in 1978 by John Carpenter. Directed by Joe Chappelle and written by Daniel Farrens, the film stands out as one of the boldest and most intricate installments in the series, as it seeks to offer a deeper, more mythological explanation for the unstoppable evil that is Michael Myers. This chapter introduces, in fact, new supernatural elements and attempts to tie together the plots of the previous films, creating a mythology that has sparked debates among fans and critics. The narrative of Halloween 6 takes place 6 years after the events of Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers, and opens with Jamie Lloyd, the young niece of Laurie Strode, on the run from a mysterious cult that has kept her and Michael Myers prisoners for years. The opening scene is particularly tense. Jamie, now grown up, manages to escape from an underground hospital run by the sect and, during her escape, gives birth to a child. This child becomes the central focus of the plot, as Jamie manages to hide him before being brutally killed by Michael in a grisly chase. The infant is found by Tommy Doyle, a character who fans of the series will remember as the child Laurie Strode saved on Halloween night in 1978. Tommy, played by Paul Rudd in one of his first film roles, is now a young adult obsessed with Michael Myers. He lives in an apartment in Haddonfield, where he has transformed his obsession into a personal investigation, collecting evidence and documents on the figure of Michael and his connection with evil. Tommy discovers that the cult, led by the mysterious man in black seen in Halloween 5, is deeply involved in Thorne's curse. This curse, according to Tommy's theories, is what gives Michael his superhuman strength and unstoppable nature, forcing him to kill all members of his family to complete a cycle of ritual sacrifices that date back to an ancient Celtic tradition. This attempt at mythological explanation is one of the most distinctive elements of Halloween 6, which deviates from the simple slasher to embrace more complex and occult themes. At the same time, Dr. Sam Loomis, played by the late Donald Pleasance, is now retired and living a relatively quiet life until he is dragged back into the fight against Michael, after Tommy reveals his findings to him. Loomis, who has tried to stop Michael for years, is skeptical but soon realizes that evil is far from defeated. Over the course of the film, Michael returns to Haddonfield and begins another massacre, focusing primarily on the Strode family, the new inhabitants of the house where Michael grew up. The Strode family is unknowingly linked to Michael's fate, as they are part of his family tree. The narrative develops with a crescendo of violence and tension, culminating in a final confrontation inside the hospital where it all began. Halloween 6 stands out from other films in the series not only by its inclusion of a complex mythology, but also by its attempt to explore horror through a more occult approach. While the first films in the saga focused on a Michael Myers who was almost supernatural but still rooted in the real world, this chapter transforms him into an almost mythical figure, the result of an ancient curse that forces him to perpetrate evil. Thorn's curse is the thematic heart of the film. This symbol, appearing as a mysterious glyph, represents a Celtic force that requires human sacrifice to protect the tribe from destruction. Michael is therefore seen not only as a psychopathic killer, but as an instrument of this ancient and inescapable evil. This reinterpretation of the character divided fans. Some appreciated the attempt to add depth to his figure, while others felt that the supernatural explanation diluted the pure, unexplained horror that had made Michael Myers so terrifying in the first films. The atmosphere of the film is dark and oppressive, reflecting the darker themes of the story. The settings, especially Myers' house and the cult's underground hospital, are presented in a way that evokes a sense of claustrophobia and inevitability. Alan Howarth's score, which mixes classic themes created by John Carpenter with new elements, helps create an aura of constant tension. Howarth uses synthesizers and distorted sounds to add an extra layer of eeriness, making each scene full of tension. The production of Halloween 6 was considerably complex and marked by numerous problems, which heavily influenced the final result. The film went through several rewrites and changes in the script, mainly due to differences between the producers and director Joe Chappelle. This tension led to the creation of two distinct versions of the film, the theatrical version, which is the one best known to the public, and the so-called producer's cut, an alternative version that offers a more coherent and in-depth vision of the events narrated. The film version, released to the public, was significantly altered from Farran's original vision. Changes included adding new scenes, cutting others, and a completely rewritten ending. This editing process created a sometimes confusing and inconsistent plot, which left many viewers perplexed. Some of the most talked about changes involve the role of Dr. Loomis, played by Donald Pleasence, whose final performance was shortened due to his death shortly after filming ended. The producer's cut, which circulated for years as a bootleg among fans, was only officially released many years later, fueling the debate over which version was better. A particularly tragic aspect of the production concerns Donald Pleasence. The veteran English actor, who had played Dr. Loomis in all the previous films in the series, died shortly after finishing his filming for Halloween 6. This fact made his character even more iconic, but at the same time gave the film a melancholic tone, like a last act not completely completed. Upon its release, Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, received generally negative reviews from critics. Many reviewers criticized the plot for its confusion and apparent abandonment of the simpler, more effective approach that had made the earlier films in the series so powerful. However, as the years have passed, the film has gained a certain cult status among fans of the saga and the horror genre in general. One of the main criticisms leveled at the film was the decision to explain Michael Myers' evil through Thorn's curse. This attempt at mythologizing the character was not appreciated by all, as some fans believed that Michael's true terror lay in his lack of motivation, his inexplicable and almost supernatural nature but still rooted in realism. However, others appreciated the boldness of expanding the character's mythology and adding new layers of complexity to the saga. The producer's cut, released many years later, further fueled interest in this chapter of the series. This version offers a more coherent narrative and respects Farran's original vision more closely, exploring Thorn's curse in more depth and offering a different ending, more in line with the themes introduced throughout the film. Many fans consider this version to be the definitive one, as it manages to make more sense of the entire narrative and respect the characters more, especially Dr. Loomis. Despite its difficulties, Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, remains an essential chapter in the Halloween saga. The film represents a turning point for the series, marking the attempt to give a deeper and more complex explanation to the actions of Michael Myers. While it wasn't universally appreciated, its impact on the franchise and the horror genre in general is undeniable. This film helped keep the legend of Michael Myers alive and left an indelible mark on the 90s horror landscape. Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, is much more than a simple sequel to a horror saga. It is a film that attempts to redefine the nature of the evil represented by Michael Myers, introducing elements of mythology and the supernatural that add a new dimension to the story. Although its ambitions were not fully realized due to production difficulties and creative controversies, the film left a lasting legacy. Even today, it is remembered and discussed among fans, a symbol of a period in which cinematic horror sought new ways to surprise and terrify audiences. Ultimately, Halloween 6 remains a divisive film, but an essential one to understand the evolution of the saga and the influence it has had on the modern horror genre. The first part ends here. See you soon for the second. If you liked the video, leave a like and a comment and subscribe to the channel. See you soon.